Broke the Wi-Fi, such is the power of those sexy, sexy dragons.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corene from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Happy book year, everyone. Welcome to our favorite time of year / worst time of year, where your friends at the Port Moody Public Library are going to count down their top 5 books of the year. Now, this year we had a lot of ups and we had a lot of downs. Ghost romance, nanobots,
Cozies. That's the worst for me, cozies.
2024 was a struggle for many of us. It had some unexpected pitfalls, legends, and lattes. Emma and I are looking at you. We had some dizzying highs, some truly gutting lows. I'm so sorry, Anton, her. I'm so sorry. I just can't. But we're here to talk about the best of the best. So these are the top 5 books that spoke to us, that made us cry, that made us feel, in some case, made us feel pretty angry, or made us feel really happy and warmed those hearts, or in Virginia's case, weirded you out the most profoundly. So for my book friends here, I'm joined, of course, by my old regulars, Virginia, Emma, and a Sadie in a pear tree. And we are going to kind of start off. I'm curious about how your year in reading went. So, Sadie, how was your year in reading?
It was okay. I feel like me and Emma talked about this yesterday a little bit. I think we both read quite a few 2024 books this year, and we kind of had a lot of books that we were pretty excited about, and not all of them delivered. And so I feel like that was kind of what my year was like, even if the books weren't published in 2024. Just that I would get very excited about books and I would be looking forward to them, and then I'd read them and they would kind of just disappoint a little bit. That being said, I went back to some of my classic themes and favorite genres and that kind of thing. And that I think really delivered for me. So there's a couple books that are going to be on my list today that kind of went back to like a traditional classic Sadie book, what you would think of a very classic Sadie book would be, and they delivered exactly what I wanted. I will say that this year I branched out with a lot more romance book, a lot more contemporary romance, which I usually blend my romance with a little bit of magic. And so in all fairness, the Ashley Pawson stuff did have a bit of magic in it as well. But I kind of went to romance a little bit more and found myself gravitating towards that. I don't know if just in the craziness of my life and the world, I was just looking for something that was a little bit happier, a little bit. You knew what was going to happen. You knew that it was going to follow the steps, however unlikely the two were going to get together in the end, and everyone was going to be happy. And so, yeah, I read a few of those and I found myself kind of gravitating towards that. So I'm going to say that my year in reading was a little unexpected. The things I was expecting to be good weren't, and the things that maybe I wasn't expecting were a little bit better than I had anticipated. And I've learned that sometimes you just got to go back to your roots and read the things you know you like.
Nice. And I love to see you getting into contemporary romance. Again, as we talked about, it's a genre that really has something for everyone, that expanding and doing such interesting things. Even romantasy, that again, we had a great episode, which everyone loved. Everyone loved. All right. Emma, what about you? How was your year in reading?
Like Sadie said, we had been talking a bit this week about how there were so many books that each of us were really excited for, or we thought were going to be really good, that I feel like I'd read so many 2024 books this year that I started the first few chapters of and just went absolutely not, which felt a little bit like a waste of time because I was trying to read a lot so that I had choices to talk about today. And then when coming up with books for today, I was like, well, that one was fine. I guess it's made the list. But I realized that a lot of the 2020, I know, well, the ones I have today are mostly pretty good. But I realized that a lot of the 2024 books that I tried this year were just not exactly my cup of tea. I did read a lot of books that I absolutely loved that were not published in 2024. But alas, I can't talk about those on the podcast today. But I was lucky enough that, like Sadie had said, when I go back to like a genre that it's like a tried and true Emma genre, when I read about like deeply messed up, mentally ill queer people and their like really complicated lives and relationships, especially like complex sister relationships. When I lean into that part of my reading taste, I found some really excellent stuff that I'm going to talk about later today. But I tried like a couple romances that I just absolutely could not get into. I tried a few sapphic romances that just weren't for me. I did read quite a few really nice graphic novels this year. So when I leaned back into the tried and true Emma genres, I found some good stuff. But it was hard to pick out 5 really, really excellent books from this year because so many of the great books I read were from last year.
Yeah, that's so fair. And it's especially frustrating because I feel like you really start getting into like last year's books and you're like, wow, this was such a great book. Wish I read it last year. Yeah. All right, Virginia. How was your year in books?
It was good. I think it's because I actually I was very lucky. I feel like I'm always happen to find good stuff for myself because I know what I like and I'm like Emma, like I will stop, right? Like I will stop. So everything that I actually end up continuing always good because like unless it's a book for like I'm forced to read on a podcast, right? Like like that I have to finish because I have no choice. But even then, I'll be like, I'll pick like 5 of them and try to pick one. So yeah, so it's been really good. I feel like it was a very productive year, probably maybe more productive than previously. Like went back to read more manga, more comics, lots of older books, which is weird for me. I generally tend to like shiny new things, but I have been reading a lot more older books, which is strange, and lots of short books this year for some reason. So yeah, it's been a good year. How about you, Corene?
Yeah, so this was a very like non-fiction-y year, I would say. A lot of the books that I read and really enjoyed were kind of nonfiction. I really liked I'm not going to name any names because I'm not going to cheat, but a lot of the nonfiction that I really liked was a little bit older, like exactly 1 year too old to talk about it today, as well as there was kind of like a return to form for a couple of authors that I really enjoyed, whose last books I thought were okay. And then this year I thought were a lot stronger. And then there was a lot of hate reading. I did a lot of hate reading this year, which is not something that I usually do, but because of the format of this podcast and the intense procrastination, I ended up reading a lot of stuff that I didn't enjoy and probably wouldn't read on my own, but I did get something out of it, mostly confusion and anger. But I did get those emotions. So like big emotions is what I felt this year, which is not bad as a theme. And so when choosing our best books, is there a particular criteria that you go off of when you're choosing them? So Sadie, is there like one particular quality or aspect?
No, I don't actually think that there is for me. I feel like it's more just an overall feeling that I got from the book. Like if I finished the book and I felt engaged by it, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to read kind of more, then it would kind of end up with more stars and is more likely to end up on this list of mine. I will say that one of my editions got added last night because it just got finished and it was not necessarily going to be on the list, but in the end it did make its way on there. But yeah, I don't know if there's a specific kind of quality. I actually looking at the books, they're quite varied. They all kind of fit with the Sadie theme, but they don't all fit with each other. And so I don't know if there's kind of one word or one quality that I would use.
All right. Emma, what about you?
Yeah, I don't really have like an overall theme that I use to pick my top books. Like I'd said, I read a lot of 2024 books, and a lot of them were just like meh. So pretty much any of the books that I did not deem meh ended up on the list because they were good enough to make it. But I have a pretty diverse selection here. I have like a kid's book, I have a manga. So I tried to kind of branch out and cover like multiple different aspects of my reading taste. But overall, I kind of just picked like, yeah, these were the ones that I liked the most. It was pretty straightforward. But it did help that I did read a lot of bad books this year, or books that I just like didn't really care for as much. So it made it pretty easy to decide. And kind of like Sadie, one of my books on my list, I finished this past Monday. I added this week, but it was really good. So I was like, you know what? We'll give it a shout out on the top books episode.
Wow, all of these like late last minute additions. I'm very impressed. All right, Virginia, what's your criteria?
I think each of the book I feel like represents something significant for me in my reading year, just like a particular aspect of it. Because it's really hard to narrow down and say like these are my top 5 books. So I have decided that okay, well, give each of these books, I'm going to pick one that represents something that's important to me this year. That's how I chose my 5 books. So, and you, Miss Corene?
There's a feeling that I get when I'm reading like a particularly good book, like a kind of like tickly, bubbly feeling in my chest that I'm just like, like, oh, this is just like filled with like buoyancy. And so these were books that kind of did that. I mean, some of them are a little sad, some of them are a little more contemplative. Some of them are just nonfiction, but there's just this kind of like sense that I get when I'm just reading something that's like particularly well done that kind of speaks to me and is giving me that kind of like fizzy little emotion.
Are you sure it's not the nanites in your chest? Are you sure?
It's either the nanites or the sleep exhaustion. Like, it's really hard to say. Well, after I'm sure many a sleepless night deciding this list, we are ready to delve into our top 5. And I don't think they're in any particular order. I mean, maybe yours are. Virginia's obviously are in a very particular order. Emma's nodding. Sadie, yeah, but we're going to choose it now, apparently. So we're going to start with Virginia. What was your 5th best book of the year?
All right. So for my 5th book, it was the easiest choice. I knew that I need to reserve a spot on my list for this particular book. Are there books that I read this year that made me feel more things? Sure. Are there books that blew me away more with spectacular writing? Absolutely. But there is no other book that made me laugh as hard as this one, which is a very tough thing to do in 2024 because it's been a year. And also, there's no other book that exemplified that banana pantsness that I love so much. There is no other book that I have reread more times than this one. And there's also no other books that have forced others to read as much as this one. I literally like ran when somebody said, oh, yes, sure, I'll read it. And I just ran to get the book. Or I just forced them to take the book with them to go home so that they can read it. I am, of course, talking about The Masters of the Nefarious. Mollusks Rampage by Pierre Le Police, translated from French into English by Luke Burns. This book was briefly mentioned previously on our 200th anniversary episode, and I submitted this as the Whose Book Is It guessing game that day as an example of a Virginia book. And I feel like the publisher, New York Review of Comics, did a really good job in summarizing the book. So I would highly encourage you to go back to that episode so you can hear an excerpt from that official book blurb read by our very own Miss Corene, who was forced to have to say on air words like ghosts frozen in ice cubes. So basically, and I said it like it was an easy way to describe this book, basically it's 3 detectives who notice that giant mollusks have climbed out of the ocean to attack and devour people. And they can verify that it's not just happening in their town, it's happening sort of all over the world because one of them has gained the superpower of being in Uganda and he saw that the giant mollusks were also there. Getting some very unclear intel from those ghosts in the ice cubes that we talked about earlier, because it's kind of hard to decipher what they're saying, they travel back in time to the primordial earth to find some clues, and they saw the tiny little sinister man, as the publisher described them, just leaving, carrying these giant mollusks, presumably to bring them back to our world and our time. So can these 3 detectives stop their evil plan, whatever that is? But first, you can't do any detective work unless you have the right pairs of pants. So to the pants store we go. This is truly the greatest graphic novel that I've read in my life. There are just so many banana pen stuff in this book. Buffets, like we talk about buffets that serve driving a car flavored chips, annoying people that like to grate nutmeg in the middle of the airplane. Like, how do you think of this stuff? It's just absolutely amazing. And I think I picked this book because I feel like I kind of read more manga and comics this year. And so that was representative of that. It's also got that coffee book quality, I think, in many different ways, because I have just been picking this up. I put it like right near me, and so that I can pick it up, flip to any page, and just get some laughs out of it every single time. And it could be any page because all the panels are just absolutely amazing. So this is one that gave me a lot of joy. And I really, really sincerely hope that the publisher will continue to translate more of his work into English. That is my number 5 pick, Masters of the Nefarious, Mollusks Rampage by Pierre Police, translated by Luke Burns.
I think you need to say it like mollusk rampage. Like it deserves that kind of spin on it. Yeah, I remember you brought this to the library and kind of put it in my hands, and I was flipping every page. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but it was nonetheless very funny. Like every page is more absurd than the last. So yeah, it's a very Virginia book.
And it's the highest compliment you can get from Miss Corene when she said, "I don't hate it." Like I feel like that's good. So yeah.
Yeah, that's as far as I'm willing to go. All right, Sadie, what is the 5th book that you hated the least this year?
All right, so this is actually the one that got added last night when I finished it on my drive to work, drive home from work, one of those two. It got added kind of after I finished it. It was not going to be on the list originally. I started it a little while ago and could not actually get into it. So I waited until I got the audiobook. And once I got the audiobook, I got into it. It's narrated by the author, which makes sense. And just hearing the voice, it brought me back to a time in my life that I will always think on fondly, that I revisit on more than one occasion, and will always be a comfort for me. And that is the world of Gilmore Girls. So this is the 3rd Gilmore Girl, the memoir of actress Kelly Bishop. Obviously talks about her time on the show, but what I didn't kind of know, and I know a little bit about her career. I know she was a dancer. I know that she started on Broadway, but I didn't know a lot about kind of how she got her start. And it goes back to obviously the very beginning, as memoirs do, and not only talked about how she got her start on Broadway in A Chorus Line. She originated the role of Sheila in A Chorus Line. She won a Tony Award for that role on Broadway, but it goes back to when her mother first entered her into ballet lessons, and she grew up in a not very happy household. Her father was an alcoholic. Her father was loud and violent. And the only time that she could find that peace and find that happiness was at the ballet. And so that kind of where she got her start. The song At the Ballet is in A Chorus Line. If you're familiar with it, that came, I didn't realize that when they first met up to discuss A Chorus Line, before it became A Chorus Line, they recorded these sessions with these dancers and these actors. And then most of the words, or a lot of the words from those sessions, word for word, made its way into the show. And so At the Ballet is basically Kelly's words, word for word, of her experience when she was a child, and how she spoke about finding ballet and finding dance when she was a child in these kind of original sessions, which I had no idea. I didn't know that that's kind of how it got started. I didn't know that's how she got started. And so, yeah, so it was so interesting to hear about her life, to hear about Broadway in the 1960s and 1970s. I'm obviously a big Broadway fan, a big musical fan. I'm familiar with a lot of the shows that she was talking about, a lot of the shows that she was doing, but it was cool to kind of hear that backstage side of it. She started work as a chorus girl, just chorus dancer, and kind of worked her way up until she figured out that she wanted to do more acting. And that's when she started experimenting in the film industry and tried to get roles like that. And one thing led to another. She got the role in Dirty Dancing almost as a fluke. The original actress for the role of Baby's mother wasn't able to do the part, and she had been cast as a bit part. And they asked her to come in early and asked her if she wanted the role. And so she had been yearning to do a movie from start to finish, which she had never done before, because she was trying to get that theater feeling, which you get from working on a play with a group of people that she'd never found in film. And when she did Dirty Dancing, she said she finally found that and kind of finally found her way to Gilmore Girls, which is, I think, where many people know her best as the matriarch of the Gilmore Girls household, Emily Gilmore. And just the way she talks about the show, the way she talks about the creator of the show, Amy Sherman Palladino, and Lauren Graham, it's just, for somebody who loves the show as much as I do, it was just really wonderful to hear But yeah, it was a very cool book to hear about her life. I didn't know anything about her personal life, so to hear about her personal life as well as her professional life was very neat. So it kind of snuck its way in as my fifth spot when I finished it. And I think I will look into more that she has done and kind of look into a bit more of her work and see.
Nice. That is a very Sadie book. And that bit about the course line, that is so interesting. All right. Well, actually, that themes quite nicely of going back to your roots, because the fifth book on my list is going to be absolutely no surprise to anyone. In fact, as soon as the book is published, you're pretty much like, yep, well, that's going to be there, as it has been every single year that Pushkin Vertigo has released one of these books. So no surprise, this is a classic kind of golden age-ish mystery. It is the sixth book in the series, again, with these very, I would say, cinematic covers. It's a series that, again, there's going to be another book coming up next year, so you might as well just reserve my fifth place right now. My fifth least hated book this year is The Little Sparrow Murders. And of course, this is by Seishi Yokomizo. This is, again, about the scruffy little detective Kosuke Kendachi, and he's trying to go on vacation, but by gum, it's just not working. He's trying to go to a hot spring to rest and relax from his big cases in the city, and yet he goes to a little mountain village where, lo and behold, 20 years ago, a horrible murder happened. And as he's there, he just can't help himself to investigate it just a little bit. However, as soon as he arrives, more people start dying, their bodies posed in strange and unnatural ways. And so, of course, he has to investigate it. Yeah, I love this series. I love these books. Again, it is that feeling of like really being in the hands of a master of what he's doing. He sold 55 million copies of his books. Oh yeah, he's like the Agatha Christie of Japan. He definitely knows what he's doing. Even though the plot and solutions are outlandish, you don't care. You don't care, because it's just like watching a really good like horse show. I don't care about horses. I don't like them. They make me nervous. But when I can appreciate someone doing a horse show with skill, I'm impressed and I'm entertained at like their proficiency, I guess. Thankfully, I do like mysteries more than I like horses, so this book really worked for me. I saw the ending coming from a mile away and I was still pleased. I was still pleased. I didn't care. I'm like, yeah, of course it was. Keep going. Write another 15, which he has, thankfully, so I'm sure I will get those next year. So again, my number 5, just like Sadie, a pure Corene book, The Little Sparrow Murders. All right, Emma, book 5.
All right. So my book 5 is the one that I talked about in the historical fantasy episode. It is not a historical fantasy. We've covered this, but this one is a young adult. Goodreads lied to me. This one is a young adult historical mystery called A Crane Among Wolves by Jane Her. I like this book a lot more than I expected. I'm not like Sadie. I don't always read a lot of YA. But when I saw this one leading into that episode, I was like, oh, this sounds good. I'll check this one out. And I was kind of pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. It's very, very dark. It's very, very violent, which I typically enjoy, that kind of darker, more sad stuff. So that really appealed to me. It takes place in late medieval Korea in the kingdom of Joseon. So it's in like year 1506. Our main character, Iseul, is on the run from the tyrannical king of Joseon, whose name is Yeonsan, after he unjustly murdered her parents, as well as like hundreds of other government officials. And later he kidnapped her older sister to become one of his thousands of concubines. So she's on the run from him. She's very headstrong and fearless, kind of a classic young adult protagonist. She's also a little bit reckless and impulsive. And she's on this mission to save her sister, to rescue her from being one of the concubines. All of which seems impossible until she meets a very handsome prince, the king's half-brother, who, because he has no legitimate claim to the throne, he's not really a threat to the brother's rule. On the surface, he's kind of this perfect prince character, when in reality, he and many of his comrades in the government are trying to plan a coup d'etat. So I've always really loved a coup d'etat story. It's like my favorite subplot in Avatar: The Last Airbender and Full Metal Alchemist. I always find them like very, very fascinating. One of my favorite parts of the book was the political intrigue. It's kind of marketed as like a murder mystery young adult romance book, but I was much more invested in this coup that they're planning against the government, more invested in kind of these like violent outbreaks that are happening all over the country. There's not a ton of like explicit action that happens. So much of what happens in the book is like conversations in the back rooms of brothels and inns and like the scheming that leads to the violent overthrow of the government. And that's what I really leaned into when I was reading it. I thought it was such a fascinating and kind of fast-paced political story with a little bit of like a romantic subplot going on underneath. It is a like long, pining, enemies to lovers romance. So if you're into that in the young adult genre, I really enjoyed it. I liked that both of the characters were kind of like hot-headed and cranky. I like people like that. I made me really want to root for them. And both the main characters were definitely like extremely flawed and had a lot of their own issues that they had to work through as they were also trying to help each other with their respective goals, with overthrowing the government, with rescuing Israel's sister. But they're the kinds of people that like, they keep messing up, but you just can't help but root for them. So I really enjoyed it. Like Corene's book, the mystery I definitely solved before I got to it. It was predictable enough that I could figure out who the murderer was, but not so predictable that it wasn't satisfying still to get to the end of it. I was still like, yep, I thought that was probably who it was, but you know what? I'm cool with it because they let you solve the mystery on your own without making it too obvious, which I really liked. And I don't typically read mysteries, so I was surprised that I liked this so much. But I think it was like the darkness, the violence, the political intrigue that was happening that I really leaned into in this book. It's also, I liked that it was about kind of real Korean history. Yeonsan is based off of an actual Korean king who was considered like one of the most tyrannical rulers in Korean history. And I didn't know a ton about like medieval Korean history before reading it. So I was really fascinated with learning about the real historical aspects of the book that Jane Her based it off of. So yeah, that was A Crane Among Wolves by Jane Her.
Interesting. I love Jane Her. I think her books are great, and I'm excited that it's kind of like outside of like what I would term like a regular Emma book. So that's very cool. All right, counting down the numbers, we are up at 4. So Virginia, what is your 4th goodest book?
I'm glad you changed that because it's definitely not my least favorite. Like, least whatever that you least and whatever you said. Yeah, I was just going to be like, no, it's definitely one of my most loved. So I know that on my top list, it's going to have to include a Japanese book in translation because I read a lot of them. And there were so many good ones. And it was very hard to decide. While I absolutely adore the mind-boggling Harlequin Butterfly by Tall Angel or Mysterious Setting by Katsushige Ebe. And yes, I'm just cheating. I'm just dropping more books in here because I feel so bad not picking them. And they're both from one of my favorite publishing lines from Pushkin, like the Japanese short story fiction series, which also includes Spring Garden and Slowboat that all came out this year and that I also love. But I knew that someone is going to mention Pushkin today. So I figured that I will just highlight another publisher instead, another 5-star read for me. And this is the first book by the author that was translated into English this year. And I'm sure the translator had lots to do with it. That is Goodnight Tokyo by Azuhiro Yoshida, translated by Hayden Trowell. The author himself says that Goodnight Tokyo is kind of like 10 books in one. And I just love the way he talks about it because what I love the most about this book is they're all intersecting kind of stories and one narrative just sort of glides silently into another. And you go from one point of view to another like very seamlessly. And I know some people would be like, that's confusing. No, it's absolutely lovely. I just love the flow of the narrative. It's one of my favorite things about this book. And the translator described Goodnight Tokyo as simultaneously a whimsical, eccentric ode to the nocturnal rhythms of one of the world's largest cities and a vivid illustration of urban solitude and the search for connection and meaning. And all these interactions among all the characters that we meet happens between the hours of 1 a.m., the time Corene goes to bed, and 4:30, the time when I wake up. So who are these people that are awake during this time in Tokyo? Well, we have taxi driver Matsui, who became a taxi driver because when he was young, he read a picture book called The Car is the Color of the Sky, about a taxi driver who drives a car that is the color of a sky. And he picks up interesting like passengers like bears and foxes. And he thought that was wonderful when he wanted to become a cab driver since then. He hasn't come across a sky blue taxi yet, but he realizes that his cab is black and, he works the night shift, so it kind of matches this guy. There's also Mitsuki, who is a procurer. She basically gathers props for different movies, and sometimes she has to search for them all night long. When we first meet her in the beginning of the book, she's looking for what is called loquats, I guess. They're these weird orange fruits that her boss claims that, oh yeah, I'm sure they're still around. You just go check out those all-night supermarkets. And that's sort of like what she was looking for when we first meet her. There's Kanako, who is a helpline operator, again, working at night at that ungodly hours. She is looking for her brother, who left just one day and disappeared and never came back. And so she's hoping that she'll be able to find him. There's Shiro, a private detective, or maybe an actor playing a detective. It's kind of hard to tell. And he is searching also for his father in these old movies. And some of his cases that are become really popular also end up being movies. There's Ayano, the owner of a diner, who's waiting for a customer that she has met before to show up again. And there's many other people that we meet. And as Kanako pointed out, it seems like the theme for this book is that everybody's missing somebody, everybody's missing something. And there's this line that she said, it's like, I can't find the last one. And that's sort of the last thing that her brother says to her. And it seems to be this theme that runs through the book. I love interconnected stories. That's one of the things that I love. And a lot of books that I read this year was that. And we have in this book, the strange and the unexpected connections that you make, even in a big metropolis like Tokyo, is the unlikely. It highlights sort of how we influence another person and that we surprisingly play a role in someone else's life, sometimes without even us knowing it. Doesn't matter where you are, including Tokyo. And so I love how different connections are made in this book. I love, of course, the non-linear sort of structure of the book. Some people describe this as a slice of life story, which I do enjoy. They're not cozy, which is great. And I feel like it's also my kind of preferred setting, where it's like a world that is definitely the world that we inhabit, but there's just a little bit something off, a little bit surreal to it. I guess you can also maybe call it magical realism. And I love the subtle kind of world building in that way. And I love meeting all these people in Tokyo during these hours. So representing, I guess, my Japanese books in translation this year is Goodnight Tokyo by Azuhiro Yoshida, translated from Japanese into English by Hayden Trowell.
Nice. All right. So, Sadie, book number 4. How much of a Sadie book is it percentage-wise?
85% Sadie book, maybe 90%, just because it's an author that have made it onto my top list before. I was originally introduced to them by Corene, actually. I think in a staff meeting, actually. I think it may have just been the book you were reading at the time when we used to talk about that in staff meetings. And it sounded interesting, so I decided to pick it up. I was wanting to explore more mystery books at that time. And so I picked it up and I loved it. And I loved this author's entire series. And this is a standalone book that just got released this year. And I think it was on my most anticipated for the summer. So it's not a huge surprise. I will say that it's not her best book. I have liked some of her other books better, but I did enjoy it. It kind of has the classic, the way that she writes, I really enjoy. And it's a relatively easy story to follow. A leads to B, leads to C, leads to D, and all that stuff. But getting the thumbs up from Corene. Yeah. But yeah, her characters are always a little bit more nuanced, which I appreciate. So this is Death at Morning House by Maureen Johnson. So this is a YA mystery. And honestly, this one actually had a little bit of a thriller feel to it. The characters are on an island, and it kind of has that there's a killer loose, you can't escape sort of feel, with a little less slasher to it, which is preferable for me because I'm not a huge slasher fan. But yeah, so this story follows Marlo Wexler, and it all started with a candle. And the candle, the internet assured her, smelled like petrichor. Now, petrichor is the smell after the rain. And it is a very kind of recognizable smell of the earth and the ground and the rain. And Akila, the girl that Marlo has been in love with for years, loves the smell of petrichor. when Marlo finally asks Aquila out on a date, and Aquila says yes, Marlo has decided to get a candle that smells like petrichor. It's wonderful. It's romantic. It's beautiful. Marlo is house sitting at this beautiful lake house. She sets up the candle. Her and Aquila start kissing. And then Aquila stops because she smells smoke. The beautiful curtains framing the beautiful window and the beautiful view have caught on fire. The beautiful petrichor candle has lit the curtains on fire, and slowly, or rather not so slowly, everything else starts to catch fire as well. In the moment, Marlo freezes. She has no idea what to do. It is Aquila that pulls her out of the house and says, "We need to call the fire department." Marlo is so embarrassed. Not only has she burnt down a house, or most of it, even though it was an accident, she feels unbelievably guilty. She also knows that she has lost Aquila forever. So when the opportunity to work on a remote island as a tour guide comes up, she can't turn it down. So she goes to this remote island and starts giving tours of Morning House. It is a house that was built for this extremely rich family. And one night, their youngest son was found drowned in the river. And later that night, their oldest daughter fell to her death off of the house roof. The family moved, the family left, and they never came back. And so now the house has stood there for decades, and they're finally opening it up to tours. So Marlo is being welcomed into this group of tour guides all around her own age, and she's not quite sure what to expect. But when she gets there, she realizes there's a little bit more going on. There's a tragedy that all of these tour guides and friends have recently dealt with that they're not telling her about. And there's more happening at this house than she thought. And when more people start turning up dead, Marlo realizes she's going to have to figure out what's going on because she can't get off the island. It's not possible. So yes, it is a classic kind of, like I said, murder mystery thriller kind of show or kind of book. Very typical of Maureen Johnson. Her characters, as I said, they have a little bit more nuance, a little bit more diversity and character to them, which is always nice. Marlo is very flawed, extremely flawed, but she makes a relatively good protagonist. You are rooting for her. You want her to figure things out. You want her and Aquila to just sort it out and figure out what's going on. So that is Death at Morning House. It was definitely up there in the top this year, as I think as far as I can predict, all Maureen Johnson books will be for me as they come out.
Yes, I think a very Sadie book indeed. All right. My fourth least offensive book of the year that I have read is in a genre that we don't talk a lot about on Keep It Fictional, but I know that there are fans of this particular genre here, which is self-help. Some of us are big fans of it and continue to read books. Does it fix our lives? No. But sometimes it's nice, like the idea that maybe you could. This book came out in early February, and I think is kind of like a very interesting trend of publishing, kind of stemming out of what happened during the pandemic. A lot of people are exhausted. A lot of people are tired. A lot of people have nothing left in the tank. They are just stumbling from day to day to day, or sometimes from hour to hour to hour. And what I have really enjoyed about books kind of written on the subject that I have read is that they acknowledge that this is sometimes really out of your hands. You can't fix systems. You can't fix capitalism. You can't fix the fact that you need to work full time and balance family and balance yourself and balance your exercise and get fed 3 times a day. It is just not possible. And I think that when people talk about this honestly and talk about their struggles honestly and talk about that sometimes you are going to drop some of the balls on the ground and there is nothing you can do about it, I think that it really reduces the stigma for people. to talk about this just bluntly and without trying to pretend that we are not caught in systems that are bound to ground us into dust. So, on that positive note, my fourth book on the list is the book The Cure for Burnout: How to Find Balance and Reclaim Your Life by Emily Ballesteros. And I'm here to say there really isn't a cure, which was great. Which was nice to hear. It is nicely balanced between this is what you can control and this is what you cannot control. And so you just need to make choices that are the best for you. And sometimes you are going to have no choices whatsoever. Just try to survive through it. It is full of kind of what is like very practical and or common sense advice. But sometimes when you are just like vibrating with stress at every minute, you just need someone to say, hey, you know, you can't take a 3-hour break. Maybe take 5 minutes to have a coffee and just take those 5 minutes and enjoy them. Just that moment. And then you can get back into it, but it's okay just to enjoy your little coffee and take a moment. The book is, again, very practical. And a lot of the critiques that I saw of it were like, this is just common sense. Not when you're stressed out, it isn't. Very, very hard to think that way. And so she is very, I would say, sympathetic and understanding, having been there herself. What I really like is that she is the child of immigrants. And so she talks a lot about like the different stresses that you can be under and the different expectations of how you deal with stress or being a perfection or having a lot of expectations placed on you and how that can be really difficult. She has a lot of different anecdotes of people that she's worked with over the years about trying to, establish boundaries with your family, with work, with yourself. It is all just very nice and practical advice on how to kind of manage that stress. And I really liked the tone that she took. I really like, again, that these books that just say there is no cure. There is not. You're just going to need to kind of manage the stress. And I really appreciated that. So I thought if you're, especially right now during the season when you feel like you're just being flung from activity to activity and no time to breathe, a book like this, even if you're not feeling totally burnt out, a lot of this stuff and advice is preventative. What you can do when you feel that kind of creeping ice cold panic of all the things you need to do, of little ways that you can help yourself or maybe take a little bit of the burden off. So if you're looking or if you need a gift for someone who feels a little overwhelmed in their life, I can heartily recommend The Cure for Burnout with Emily Ballesteros. All right, so let us look over to Emma. Emma, what is your fourth most enjoyed book amongst all the books that you enjoyed?
All right, bit of a tonal shift here. This one is my only kids book that I have on the list for today. So I read a lot of kids graphic novels for the comic club that we do here at the library. And I try to pick newer ones so that hopefully I can pick books that the kids haven't already read 100 times. And of all the comics that I read this year, this one was my favorite. And this is the book that I finished this past Monday. So this one made the list at the very last minute. But I was like, you know what? That book deserves a spot on the list. So we're going to throw it in there. And this one is called Plain Jane and the Mermaid by comic expert Vera Brosgol, who I think Corene got to meet once, which I would love to hear more about later. So this book is about plain Jane. Jane is pretty plain looking. She's a bit heavier set. And she's in her teenage years, kind of vaguely. And she spent most of her young life believing that she wasn't good enough. She wasn't pretty enough. She wasn't likable enough or smart enough. Her parents, always criticized her for her looks. They would be at the beach and, putting hats on her so that she didn't get freckles and calling her fat all the time. It was pretty bad. The fat phobia in the book is pretty rough. And they always favored her kind of sweet and cuter younger brother, who in a tragic accident on the beach when they were little, disappeared into the ocean when he was a baby. So at the beginning of the book, we learn that Jane's parents just recently died and that her house is being given to her terrible, egocentric older cousin since her parents have no male heir. And the only way for Jane to be able to stay in her home, for her to save her home, is if she marries so that the house can be passed down to a male. So Jane decides to propose to Peter, a local fisherman's son and the most handsome boy in town. And Peter kind of reluctantly agrees to marry her, mostly out of pity, but also so that he can escape having to work for his father on the docks. People always catch him like looking in mirrors and checking himself out rather than actually working. So he's like, oh, I can be a pretty little house husband and get the house for you. Sounds great. I'm in. So Peter agrees to marry Jane. And almost immediately after, he is swept away into the ocean by a mermaid who has her own intention of marrying him, and then also eating him after she marries him, as mermaids do. So this is this like beautiful, mysterious mermaid just comes and kidnaps Peter. And Jane is like, oh my God, what do I do? My fiance is gone. So she goes to this mysterious old crone in the town to try to get some help to go down into the ocean and rescue Peter from the mermaid village. We learn later on that the mermaids marry and then eat attractive young boys because it helps them stay young forever. It helps them stay young and pretty and immortal. So there's these really interesting messages of like Jane wants to marry Peter because she's not pretty enough. And the mermaid also wants to marry Peter so that she can stay pretty. But the mermaid is villainized for being this like vain, beautiful creature. And then like having this kind of antagonistic relationship with Jane. It's got these really fascinating messages about beauty and about young womanhood and the way that girls are raised growing up to believe that you can only really be worthy if you're beautiful. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the book. I really liked its strong feminist message. It had really interesting critiques of appearances and of vanity, which I think is really important for young people to hear. My favorite character is this kind of grumpy but kind Selkie that Jane befriends to help her rescue Peter from the mermaids. And I realized a couple weeks ago we had talked about our favorite like mythical creatures in one of our existential questions. And I'm changing my answer. It should absolutely be Selkies because I've read quite a few Selkie books this year and I really, really love them. The Selkie in this book was my favorite character. So yeah, all the morals aside, the story was a really engaging adventure story. I read it cover to cover. I thought Vera Brosgol is a really excellent storyteller and a really excellent illustrator. I haven't read her other kids graphic novel, Be Prepared, yet, but I love her picture book. A lot of the stuff she does is really beautiful. And Jane is a really thoughtful and tenacious and flawed character, but a character that you can't help but root for throughout the story. So if you like kids books, if you're looking for a book to give a kid in your life for the holidays, I would really recommend Plain Jane and the Mermaid. I absolutely loved it.
Nice. Great choice. Great choice. All right. We're down to our final 3. Is anyone feeling the stress of this? Are you feeling like you've made good choices? As much as we can. All right. So I'm going to swing it over to Virginia. What was your bronze medal winner?
All right. This is a book I've already talked about in the most anticipated episode. Did not disappoint, thankfully. And it is published by one of my favorite small presses, and Other Stories. It is my favorite book title of the year. It is the Thinking About Gladys Machine by Mario Levero, translated from Spanish into English by Annie McDermott and Kit Schruter. It's a Uruguayan writer that is a favorite writer of many of my favorite Latin American authors like Alejandro Zambra, Alvaro Enrique. And the translator actually said that in Latin America, it said that Chile produces poets, Argentina produces short story writers, Mexico produces novelists, and Uruguay produces los raros, which is the strange ones. And I think Mario Levero definitely fit into that definition. But I'm sure he doesn't really like being pigeonholed. And at one point he said, stop expecting me to do new weird things, because he really likes to have that freedom to write whatever you want. I do feel that reading his stories, I think any attempts to try to label his stories are kind of inadequate, whether he's writing about the Thinking About Gladys Machine, whether he's writing about girls that do house demos with maybe a circus that is following them, right? Whether he's writing about lighters that kind of you unscrew them and it sort of infinitely expand into weird worlds inside, whether he's writing about spiders that your neighbor may be training to perform acrobatics, whether he's writing about little tiny people swimming in your sink or coming out from your pipes, or ants that may be building statues of ants, or a boy looking for a key to a room that he's never seen before in his house. Whatever that he's writing about, I think what I love about his book is that the stories are always about these strange things that happen in your everyday life. despite all the strange things, it feels very realistic. And what I love about his work, and as the author said himself, he likes to write about experiences that you experience maybe on a different plane of existence or a different plane of reality. And so it's like, it is our world, but like he just adds these things to it. And I also really, really think he's a great short story writer because he's got the perfect short story ending where at the end, you leave with whatever that happens. And he invites you to imagine the rest. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. And you cannot help but kind of think, okay, next, this is going to happen. Because in your head, you are kind of letting the story, you're continuing the story. And I love that he's able to do that with his short stories. And it always seems like I don't know much about Lavero. I should read more about him. I know that he's a very private person. He doesn't like publicity. He doesn't like to do any of that. But it just seems like from reading his story, he just seems like such a good-natured person. And so I think that's always something nice when you get that feeling from his stories. There are a couple other books that have been translated into English, so I cannot wait to get into those. I've got one sitting in my home. And he also has a book, which please someone go translate it because it is called, I know nothing about it except that it's called Nick Carter Enjoys Himself While the Reader is Murdered and I Expire, which I think is like a great, great title. So I don't know Spanish. Maybe I have to take some Spanish lessons from Emma, but please somebody go translate it so that I can read it. This book is also important in my reading year because I think, as I mentioned on our recent translator, who is also an author episode with Miss Corene, one of the few people whom I have taken a lot of recommendations this year from is the translator and author Kit Strutter. And I think choosing a translator, as we mentioned, choosing what they translate is really a recommendation and endorsement to the book. And so after reading through his own short story, cartoons, and then reading the Thinking About Gladys Machine and seeing, it's co-translated by him. I have sought out like a lot of his other translations. He has really introduced me to many different authors from all over the world. So this is translated that I feel like has the most influence on my reading life this year. So if you are open to kind of like noticing those strangeness in our everyday life, I would highly recommend this short story collection, The Thinking About Gladys Machine by Mario Lavero, translated from Spanish into English by Annie McDermott and Kit Strutter.
What I especially liked is when you held your phone up, at least for me, it just looked like a white square. And I was like, that could be the cover of it. That could absolutely be the cover of such a book.
That's the thing about this particular publisher. They don't do covers. They just put the first line of the book. So that's what they have been doing this past year. So
I was so upset I dropped my notebook at that. All right, Sadie, if this was a wedding anniversary themed thing, this would be the leather book. So what is your leather book this year?
Okay, the leather book this year. I don't know if this will show up on anyone else's. I'm actually not sure. So this is one that we all actually had, in my mind, the joy of going to see this author live. We did a lovely trip together. He came to Vancouver earlier this fall in September, and we all had the opportunity to go. It was unfortunately cut short due to a medical emergency, but I enjoyed every second of it leading up to that point. And I had not read this book yet. This is the sequel. This is the only sequel that I put onto my top 5. My honorable mentions will probably have a few more sequels, but this is the only sequel that made it onto the top 5. And I will preface this by saying that I did not enjoy this book as much as the first one, but I cried in this book more than I have cried in a book maybe ever, possibly ever, which is not a good thing when you're listening to the audiobook. And you listen to audiobooks when you're driving. So I had to, I did not have to pull over. I know Fiona told us a story about when they had to actually pull over because they were crying so much because of an audiobook. And I never had to do that. But there was definitely some moments where I considered it. So this is Somewhere Beyond the Sea by T.J. Klune, the sequel to The House in the Cerulean Sea, which, if you listened to our 200th episode, was the book that I said every single person should read. When asked the question, what is a book that you would recommend to every single person that you think every single person should read? I will say that The Houses in the Cerulean Sea is. And everyone, and I know this is not true across the board, but most of the people that I have recommended the book to have also loved it. We have turned my mother-in-law into a Clunian. I'm going to say into a Clunian. She absolutely loves TJ Klune. We got signed copies of the book from going to this event, and we got one of them signed to my mother-in-law, which she was absolutely ecstatic about. So that was nice to be able to give to her. So this is the sequel to House in the Cerulean Sea. It follows once again Arthur Parnassus, who is the master of an orphanage on the island of Marsyas, and it now follows him and his partner Linus and their life with the children that are in their care. And this involves a garden gnome, there's a forest sprite, there's a green blob who wants more than anything just to be a bellhop and is really, really very good at it. There is a shapeshifter, there is a wyvern, and there is the Antichrist, Lucifer. So it brings us back to them as a family. It brings us back to their struggles. Arthur is now looking back at his own past when he lived on the island as a child and how he had been mistreated, abused, both physically, mentally, emotionally, by the master of the orphanage that he was living in because of the creature that he was. And it brings us to a new struggle for this family where somebody new is coming to the island to make sure, in their words, that the children are being well taken care of. And they learn very quickly that the system that has been put into place has been set up for them to fail, no matter what. They will not be deemed appropriate guardians for these children. And so it's a story of them figuring out how to fight back against the system, how to keep their family together. Like I said, I bawled. I absolutely bawled in this book so many times. I don't know if it was just like the family connections that got me or just like the fierce loyalty that these children and Linus and Arthur had for each other. But it was just, yeah, I couldn't stop crying. And I mean, I cry quite easily. I will preface this by saying that I do cry quite easily, but this book it just got me. Like just certain lines, I can't think of any right now, but I'd be perfectly fine. I'd be driving along, listening to the book, laughing hysterically at one part, and then they would just say something, and I'd be like, oh no, and it would just it would just go. So I think that for this one is why it made it onto my top 5 list. I wouldn't necessarily say it was the best book that I read this year. I think that, and me and Emma talked about this a little bit, TJ Klune is quite open about what he wanted to do with this book, kind of the stance that he wanted to take in this book, which is an unbelievably important stance, and it's an unbelievably important message that he wanted to send. But I think that whether just because I knew that going into it or whether he leaned into it, it was very, very pointed. It was an extremely pointed message. You knew the entire time exactly what the message that he wanted to send was, which is fine. But I think that at times it had kind of the side effect of taking over the story a little bit. But I do think like his characters are just so, so good. The newest character, who is David, who is a Yeti, may have been one of my favorites. He's a Yeti, a 10-year-old Yeti who just wants to be an actor and do like his own little one-man performances. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. So yeah, so I think the characters, the fact that I couldn't stop crying, are what made this book wind up on my top 5. So if you haven't read House in the Cerulean Sea, I would recommend that one. And then quickly follow it up by Somewhere Beyond the Sea. I don't think I'm giving anything away because he announced it to audiences. There is a 3rd book in this series. He admitted that at the end of the event, that there will be a 3rd book in this series. So I'm looking forward to that as well. He also has a new one coming out in February, which I'm excited about, which will probably make its way onto my most anticipated. So yeah, that is my number 3, my leather book.
Nice. Yeah, and that was an absolutely lovely evening. If you ever have the chance to go and see him live, I would heartily recommend it. It was very fun. All right. Well, I'm back on my burnout, and this time in fictional version. This is a book that I believe I have talked about before, maybe on my most anticipated. Maybe Liz talked about this book. It has been talked about, but it's clocking in at number 3. This is the Cozy Not Cozy. Welcome to the Hyunimdong Bookshop by Hwang Borum, translated by Shanna Tan. And this book, again, a little bit surprised me. I thought when I talked about it before, it was going to be like very cozy. Lady has a high-powered job, quits high-powered job to become like cupcake salesman or whatever, essentially Hallmark movies, as they all do, because apparently all ladies want to run a cupcake shop or like a cozy little small business, which actually sounds exhausting. And this book really surprised me. So it was a bestseller in Korea and then translated into English as well as in Spanish and a couple of other languages. And it is about our main character, Youngju, who is burnt out. She has a very intense career. She has a very demanding marriage. She has a very busy life in Seoul. She feels like she's constantly going from here to there with no time to breathe. She should feel really successful. She should feel like her life is complete. She's achieving everything that everyone thinks she's supposed to achieve. But in fact, she just feels drained. She feels empty and she feels nothing. And so she decides to walk away from her seemingly perfect life and open a little bookshop. Now, again, if this was a Hallmark movie, this would mostly be about the trials and tribulations of wacky customers coming in and very little like financial oversight about the realities of owning a small business, but less about the construction of it. Legends and lattes, I'm again looking at you. This is, I think, like a realistic version of what would happen if someone did like this. And what really surprised me about this particular book is it is, yes, about healing, about kind of recovering yourself after losing yourself to other people, to the demands of life, to the struggle of kind of making a living. It is about that healing and what it takes to heal, but then it is also staunchly anti-capitalist that really shocked me. That again, it is that acknowledgement of that system that you are in, that you can do very little about, and so you have to do what you have to do to protect and survive. What I like about this book as well is that we get different snapshots of different characters that Youngju works with. The man who opens a little cafe, who did everything right in his life, went to the right university, studied very hard, is unable to find a job. To her friend who grounds coffee beans, who's in a very unfulfilling relationship with someone who doesn't respect her in the way that she wants, but everyone is telling her he's a great guy. So it is a very layered book and has so much more than kind of like the Hallmark way that a guy is really just going to solve all of your financial and psychological woes, which I really, really loved and appreciated. I can't wait to see what Shanna Tan translates next. I think I have her new book actually on my bookshelf at home, perhaps, or it's coming out next year. But again, a really strong, wonderful book about healing, and then also like a beautiful acknowledgement of the tough situation that we find ourselves in life. All right, Emma, we come to your Charmed number 3, Charmed for, of course, the television series and the Power of 3. But what is your Charmed book?
My Charmed book is a sports manga, which is like my absolute favorite subgenre of anything. Everybody knows that I'm obsessed with Haikyuu. So when I discovered this sports manga, which is less about teenage boys, more about young adult women, I was like, okay, let's try something different. I love sports manga because they teach you something new. They tell you a story of like the joy of learning something new, of learning a new hobby, learning a new skill, but without being like super pedantic or boring about it, which is what I really appreciate about Haikyuu. Like the main character doesn't know anything about like the technicalities of volleyball. And so you're learning about volleyball while he is, and you're like falling in love with it while he is, and like falling in love with all of these other characters you're meeting. And it's just beautiful. And I love it so much. So I was super psyched to find out that a new sports manga about young adult women learning how to skateboard was coming out this year. There are currently 4 volumes out. The 5th one comes out in February of next year. But volume 1 came out in April of 2024. So I read all 4 of the 2024 volumes. And this manga is called Sketchy, and it's by a author illustrator named Maki Hirochi. So Sketchy is a josei manga, meaning it's kind of intended for young adult women. And I don't really read a lot of josei manga. I feel like a lot of them that I see are about like workplace romances, which doesn't really appeal to me. So I was really excited to find one that was like about sports, and it's not explicitly sapphic, but it does have a lot of like sapphic undertones going on. So I had a ton of fun with this one. And we unfortunately don't have it here at the library, so I got it from VPL. Corene, we should get Sketchy. It's very good. And there's only 4 books. It'll fit on the shelf. So it follows this group of young adult women in their 20s and 30s who are learning how to skateboard in Tokyo. It features a pretty large cast of characters, so different chapters follow different people and kind of their backstories, their journeys learning to skateboard. Some of them are learning to skate for the first time. Some of them are kind of more veteran, experienced skaters. But the story mainly follows these 2 women named Ako and Shiho, who work together at a video store, and they're both kind of like searching for that deeper meaning in their lives. Like neither of them are super in love with their jobs at the video store. Ako is in her 30s, and she's kind of dating this deadbeat boyfriend who's been working on his screenplay for like the past 15 years. And so she's like kind of looking for a little bit more purpose in her life. And she's not really getting that at her job or through her friendships with the other women that she hangs out with. But she's actually able to find it through discovering skateboarding. The 2 women meet another character named Maririne, who is a more experienced skater and a skateboarding filmmaker. A lot of skaters kind of gain popularity by like videotaping themselves and then putting them on the internet and getting likes and whatnot. But Maririne is actually the only or the first female skateboarding filmmaker in Japan. So she's got this huge goal where like she wants to make really incredible films. She wants to prove that like women can make just as good of skateboarding films as men can. And she ends up befriending Ako and Shiho and teaching them some of the basics of skating and inviting them to come hang out with other skater girls. So pretty soon they have this big community, both of newbies and veteran skaters alike, that are all kind of going out skating together. I really loved the fact that this was a book about like women participating in a sport that's pretty male dominated. As a kid, I did taekwondo. And so that was a sport that like I was often the only girl in my classes. I was often like kind of dealing with bits of misogyny through that. So I loved seeing the representation of women being like, hey, we're just as good of skaters as men. We can make skateboarding films too. We can do this thing that's really male dominated. So I really liked that. And I really loved the like bonding over a shared love of a sport. One of the things about sports manga that really appeals to me is I find it so wholesome. I love how it brings out like the kindness in people. The more veteran skaters are helping the newer skaters learn. And they build this really beautiful community together. They just want to support each other and help each other achieve their goals, which I really loved. So it's a really great sports manga. You learn a little bit more about the women and kind of the other trials and tribulations going on in their lives. So it's not just about the sport. You're also kind of like dealing with many real world problems, like job problems. One of the women like cheated on her partner with her boss or something. There's all these different like complications happening, all these different kind of issues that these people are dealing with. And they're kind of turning to skating, turning to learning something new to kind of change their lives in a more positive way, which I really loved. I loved like the community aspect and the like bettering yourself aspect of the story. So if you like sports manga, I'd highly recommend it. If you like Haikyuu, I'd highly recommend it. But I really loved that this one was the first sports manga that I read that is more about women than it is about men, which was cool. And there are little spreads throughout the book that feature real life female skaters and like their backstories and photos of them, which I thought was super cool, kind of bringing awareness to real life, like badass Japanese female skaters. So yeah, that was Sketchy by Maki Hirochi, and a new volume of it is coming out in February to look forward to.
Message received. You can fill out a purchase request form on our website. All right. Well, now we move into our silver medalists that were not quite good enough to be number one. So let's swing it over to Virginia. What book was not quite good enough?
So that's a really mean way to describe this book, because it's not just not quite good enough. It's just as good, but just for whatever reason, when I decide on this list, it has to go on number two. Anyway, this is another book that has been on my most anticipated book list. And I know I said in the first book, yeah, that's the most banana pants book that I read, when I talk about Masters of the Nefarious. But let's be honest, all my books are banana pants, and this one is just as weird. And I think it is also just as strange. And I look back on my spreadsheet, and this one actually only got 4.5 stars. And yes, half stars are allowed on my spreadsheet. But why is it number two? Because there are other books below it that has more stars at the point when I was reading them. I think it's because this is a book that I couldn't stop thinking about. Everything about it just stays with me, and I will, very similar to the graphic novel that I talk about, just I like to pick it up every now and then and just open it up and just read a sentence, because the sentences are so random and I love them. And so everything in this book just scream like banana pants. And so I feel like this is very much my book. So this is Overstaying by Ariana Koch, translated from German into English by Damien Searles. And it is published by Dorothy Project, which is another imprint that I love, love, love. I've talked about this, so I'm not going to elaborate too much on it, but basically we have a narrator who still lives in her hometown, and she keeps saying she's going to leave. She doesn't want to live here anymore, but she never does. And the most she would do is just to go to the train station and see what options she has in leaving town. One day she came across this new visitor who has never seen before, new to the town, and she was very intrigued. And so she invited, or maybe he just follows her. It's very unclear. But they end up in their house, and he ends up staying there in a house where there's also maybe some sentient vacuum cleaner nozzles. Anyway, there's this very strange relationship between the two. And a question that you'll be asking yourself is this visitor even human? What is going on? Because, it's described as having a lot of hair that just keep growing and he won't cut. It's described as to howl at night, but also talk on the phone. Described as not really understanding each other. There might be some language barriers there, but yet also the visitor likes to tell stories and she likes to listen to them. And also that she's convinced that the visitor comes in to eat her socks at night. So yeah, there's so many points when I'm reading. I'm like, wait, what? Let's read that again. What was that? And I will read the sentence again. I'm like, oh, okay, it did say what I thought it said. It's not that I understand what's going on. But it definitely have a lot of qualities that I love about books. I think this year, a lot of my books, like I mentioned, are shorter. And this one definitely is. It also has that ambiguous ending. And I love a book that you can interpret the ending in so many different ways, or interpret not just the ending, but the story itself in many, many different ways. And I think it kind of goes to be a little bit more the experimental nature of the books and many of the books that I read this year. And also the other weird element that it seems to be shared among a lot of books is that I read a lot of unnamed narrator books, and I'm not really sure why, but it's just no one has a name for some bizarre reason. Anyway, it's a book that I love. It is so strange, so bizarre, so confusing, but I just love it. And I feel like it is a book made for me. It is a debut novel, so I cannot wait to find out what this particular author does next. And hopefully someone will translate it so that I get to read it. So I'm looking forward to the next book. This one is on my number 2. Definitely good enough to be number 1. Also, it is Overstaying by Ariana Koch and translated by Damien Searles. We are going to go to Sadie. Sadie, what is your number 2 book?
All right. So this I talked about on our dragon episode. And I think that both me and Virginia decided that neither of us really read dragon books or seek out dragon books or necessarily enjoy dragon books. But this one, for me at least, was an exception because I ended up really, really loving this book. And so it did make its way into my number 2 spot. I am so excited for the sequel, which I think is now October 2025. Which is a very long time to wait. But they are quite hefty books, so I understand why it's taking a little bit longer to write, and that's okay. This one, I think, was over 700 pages, so I'm sure the next one will be as well. So this is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. This one is kind of set in a fantasy world. We don't know too much about the world, apart from the fact that many, many years ago, there were dragons in the world, and people would train them, and sometimes they were cruel to them to break them. And eventually the dragons gave up and decided to fly into the sky and turn themselves into moons. So they did not have to deal with the people anymore. Every so often, one of these moons would fall, and the dragon would come tumbling back to Earth. This is now the world that we live in, a world with many moons, a world where dragons are back, but where dragons are not always the way that you think they are. People are searching for them. People are trying to find very, very rare dragons, the bones of very, very rare dragons. And also, people are just trying to get by. So our story follows Rave. And in true Sadie fashion, Rave's job is to kill. She is a blade. She is an assassin. And that is what her responsibility is in the rebellion group, the Fear d'Ath. And Rave is good at it, as most of these protagonists that I like to read about are. They're very good at the killing that they do. She completes her orders. She never gets caught until someone very close to her is killed. And they are killed to send her a message. And so Rave decides that she can't do it anymore. She can't risk the people around her. She can't put more people in danger. And so she decides that she's going to track down the person who killed this person who's very close to her and kill him for good so that she will always know that the people around her will be safe. Does not go exactly the way that she wants. She ends up being captured. She ends up being given the choice between being executed by being eaten by a dragon, being ripped apart by a dragon, or to be killed in a much more humane way. She does not get to make the choice, though. It is made for her, and the people decide that she will be eaten by a dragon. So when she is tied to the post, and a gigantic dragon comes and rips her off of it, she doesn't know why. It feels like she is being taken somewhere. The dragon is not eating her. The dragon is holding her in its mouth and carrying her somewhere until it spits her back out again. And she is face to face with someone named Con Vagor. Now, she met Con. Con came to visit her in the prison and gave her healing magic that basically saved her life. But now Con has saved her once again, and she's not quite sure what to think of him. So this starts a very dramatic romance. This is a very dramatic romantasy. It involves dragons. It involves secret identities. It involves memory loss of who these people were at one time. I know, Corene, that's not your favorite romance trope. It's handled tastefully, I will say that, in this book. But yeah, it's just kind of one of those epic romance fantasy books that just kind of fit all of the things that I was looking for. I will definitely be reading the sequel. I loved this book. I'm very, very excited for the sequel. I'm curious what happens with Rave and where she kind of goes from here. She's one of those very, very hurt, very damaged protagonists who feels that she can't find happiness because of the person that she is. And she kind of starts to find that in this book, but then decides once again that she's not worth it. And so she kind of makes a choice where she doesn't get that in the end. And so I'm curious to know what happens to her in book number 2. So that is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker, my number 2 pick. And I believe the one that ended up on our staff contest, which I don't think anyone had a hard time picking that one for me.
Only Virginia knows that as master of the game. Sadie, I have to ask, are these sexy dragons or not sexy dragons?
No, the dragons themselves are in no way sexy, not even a little bit. They are like very stereotypical dragony dragons, large beasts that, have wings and scales and all that kind of stuff. However, the male character, who is not technically a dragon, is sexy. So they kind of balance it out with non-sexy dragons, but sexy men and women and other people. So hopefully that answers the question.
That definitively does answer the question, because I feel like if they were sexy, you would know. You would be able to like immediately tell. Well, how disappointing. And again, to shift tracks rather completely, I am going to talk about, wait, I looked this up. My garnet choice. That's like your second anniversary is apparently garnets, which is odd. I don't think I would enjoy that. But anyways, here we are. My second book is the one that I chose as one of my staff picks. It is a children's book, and this was an unexpected little gem. When I looked at the cart, I thought that the cover looked weird and a little disconcerting for a children's book. And then I started to read it and found myself utterly enchanted by the world that the author wrote and drew. This is what we at the Port Moody Public Library call a first fiction book. So it's an early chapter book. It is beautifully illustrated, wonderfully written, and it's a book where not a lot happens. My garnet book of this year is Little Shrew by Akiko Miyakoshi. Now, this particular author has done a lot of beautiful picture books that are kind of like infused with a weird melancholy. I think one of my favorites that they've done is a picture book about, I think it's like a mole who owns a hotel where many people come and go and send him postcards. And one day he dreams about having a journey of his own, but has yet to leave his little post in his hotel. And this kind of like quiet, slightly sad storytelling infuses this story of, frankly, a slightly frightening looking little shrew. They're not one of like nature's cuties. And yet this little shrew lives in a human animal world and just goes about doing his little things. He lives in his apartment. The shrew is a very, very hard worker with a very strict schedule and likes to do exactly what they like to do at the exact time. And while this collection of 3 very short stories, nothing much happens, they're infused with kind of unexpected joys of normal everyday life. The little shrew enjoys doing a puzzle for the first time. The little shrew loves the scent of freshly baked bread. Little shrew has a visit from the friends, and they play music together into the night until the friends go away until their next visit, and little shrew is alone with his little slippers. This is a beautiful story about a little life, which I always like books about. Someone who's just kind of going about in their little world. Nothing grand happens, nothing exceptional. It's a very kind of quiet existence about how simple joys are actually really profound and how you need to savor all the small little wonderful things that you meet in the middle of your monochrome days. So even if you are an adult, even if you're not regularly picking up children's books, I would really, really recommend that you pick up this quiet, simple, wonderful little ode to the little pleasures in life in The Little Shrew. The shrew grows on you. The shrew grows on you. The eyes are still very startling, but the slippers are awfully cute. Awfully cute stuff. Yeah. All right. So, Emma, your silver medalist your Garnet Wonder, the book that wasn't good enough to be the first book, yet is still pretty good and better than that third one. What is your second place finisher?
My Garnet book, actually, conveniently enough, also has a red cover, the cover of Garnet. So I spoke about this one in our Star Signs episode. So you've heard a bit about the plot before. But this is Interesting Facts About Space by Emily Austen. Her debut book came out in like 2021 or 2022, but I didn't read it until this year. And I just like plowed through. I say all of her stuff. She only had 2 full novels out so far. But I plowed through her whole catalog because I just like could not get enough of this author's writing. So even though I talked about this book in our Star Signs episode, I'll give a quick recap of the plot. So it is about Enid, who is she's 26 years old. She's half deaf. She's a lesbian, and she's also an information architect for the space agency. And Enid is obsessed with true crime podcasts and also very deeply anxious and paranoid, which the true crime doesn't really help with all of that anxiety and paranoia. She's got this irrational fear of bald men, which kind of takes over her entire life throughout the book. And she starts believing that a bald man is stalking her. She finds evidence that someone has broken into her apartment, and she convinces herself that she sees a bald man looking at her through her window. She realizes that one of her new neighbors, who's just moved in, is bald. And in a desperate attempt to avoid him in the hallway, she breaks into her ground level apartment just to avoid possibly running into him in the lobby, like a normal person. So Enid's anxieties and her behaviors become increasingly more irrational, increasingly more unhinged as the book goes on. And we learn more about the traumas that she's dealt with throughout her life and how those have kind of affected her and how she's grown into an adult. She was pretty severely bullied as a kid. She watches these old YouTube videos of herself as a preteen and a teenager, and she talks about this act of watching these videos as a form of self-harm, which isn't great. She casually dates and hooks up with a series of women rather than committing to a relationship, and promptly ghosts them when she feels that they're becoming too close to her. They're trying to get to know her too well. She's got very strict barriers up where she doesn't really let people get to know her that closely. Eventually, Enid finds that she can no longer run away from all of her problems, including the problem of the suspicion that a bald man is following her. And she must kind of contend with her growing suspicion that something might actually very seriously be wrong with her indeed. So this is the third book of Emily Austen's that I've read. I really loved her debut novel, Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead, which is also about kind of a similarly like deeply messed up, mentally ill queer millennial woman, which seems to be a trend in my reading. If there's like a messed up queer millennial that just continues to make terrible decisions, I'm probably going to like the book a lot. I like these books that kind of just snowball as they go, as the characters kind of get deeper and deeper into the problems until everything comes to a head. But the books aren't just like depressing and messed up. Emily Austen is really excellent at making these really messed up people like deeply, deeply funny. She incorporates a lot of really intelligent, like dark humor and irony in her writing. Me and my partner have said that she writes page turners about nothing. Like these are the kinds of books where there's not a lot of plot going on. It's kind of just like mundane. Like you follow Enid as she goes to the grocery store. You follow her as she goes to work all the time. And Emily Austen has this uncanny ability of making the mundane so interesting and so hilarious. I think she also writes really interesting and realistic and unique romantic relationships. None of her books are romances, but her characters tend to be dating or you meet their love interest throughout the stories. And she has a really interesting take on romance where it doesn't become the center of the plot, but it adds a lot of character development to these people. So I also really liked Emily Austen's poetry collection that came out in 2024. This is one of my honorable mentions. It was called Gay Girl Prayers. And if you want to learn more about it, I think Virginia spoke about this book in our poetry episode. And I would recommend it to any queer who is coming to terms with their Catholic guilt. It was really, really fun, a super quick little read. And she also has a new book coming out in January 2025 called We Could Be Rats. So there's more Emily Austen to look forward to in the future. So yeah, Emily Austen, if you're listening, I will read your grocery lists and I will probably put them on my best books of the year list because I just love everything she does. And I think she does a really great job of writing like mentally ill millennials that are relatable and realistic and characters that I just like really fall in love with. So yeah, that was Interesting Facts About Space, my silver medal book.
Nice. Before we go to gold, we are going to save some space for our honorable mentions. Books that didn't quite make it to the 5 mark. We liked them, but maybe not as much as we liked these 5 other books, but still want to give them a bit of a shout out. Now, Virginia, I know you've already been cheating this episode, so would you like to officially mention your honorables?
Sure, and I will continue to cheat some more in a bit later. So my honorable mentions, there are so many, but You Dream of Empires by Alvaro Enrique, translated from Spanish into English by Natasha Wimmer, about Hernan Cortes coming into Mexico City. Give every historical fiction is as fun and as hilarious as Enrique can make it. I would be a fan of the genre, but alas, there's only one Alvaro Enrique. And then the other one is Napalm in the Heart by Paul Gouache, I think. It's translated from Catalan into English by Maya Fade Leatham. It's about in the near future, a mother and son staying together at the edge of the forest, and there's bad stuff happening. And I think poets, even though I don't read poetry, but poets should definitely be novelists because their books are always so good. This year there's this book, and then there's a Kaval Abark with Martha, and then there's Clay Mendoza with Fury, but all so good. Sentences are just absolutely spectacular. So I like to probably look into more poets that have become novelists in the new year. One of my favorite short story collection, Ghost Roots by Pemi Aguda, a Nigerian author, possibly the best short story collection that I have read, and it's a debut, so it's just like amazing. This is the collection has like such a unifying theme. Like I can tell that this is one of her story, and it's kind of like I wouldn't say it's horror, but there's definitely horrific things in it. And hopefully, maybe at some point on Keep It Fictional, I'll be able to talk a little bit more about that book. Way Far Away by Avelio Rosero, translated by Anne McLean and Victor Meadowcroft, from Spanish into English. Probably the most haunting novel that I have read this year. Another teeny tiny little book from a Colombian author that is new to me, and I'm so glad that he has a nice backlist that I can go to. Published by New Directions, about a grandfather looking for his missing granddaughter and went into this very strange town where it's always covered in fog. There's dead mice everywhere, and the kids play with, I don't know what is the word sinister, but the kids play with sinister soccer balls. So that is the one that I could not stop reading, but it's also like just ugh. And then James, I'm so happy, Percival Everett, you finally got all the awards that you absolutely deserve. I am so happy for you. And last but not least, The Burning Plain by Juan Brufo, translated by Douglas Weatherford from Spanish, another short story collection. And what I find amazing about him is that he can do such straightforward prose. He doesn't need anything speculative or anything strange, but he can just like hold your heart in his hands and he just squeeze it. So I love his story. And I know that Emma is going to mention interesting facts about space, so I didn't think I need to talk about it. And I know that Sadie is going to talk about Somewhere Beyond the Sea probably. So also those, of course, are also on my list. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking now because I can go on.
We didn't time anyone this time, so I feel like you did an admirable job. All right, let's sling it over to Sadie's honorable mention.
Okay, so there are lots of sequels. The Book That Broke the World by Mark Lawrence, the latest in the Melissa Blair series, A Vicious Game. There's, I think, one or two more books in that series, and I cannot wait for those ones to come out next year. Heist Royale by Kavion Lewis, which is the sequel to Thieves' Gambit, which is like a YA heist action adventure kind of book, which I absolutely love. So that one was really good. A novel love story by Ashley Poston I put on there. So this is actually, I would almost say it's almost a companion book to The Dead Romantics, which I talked about on our Ghost Romance episode. I think I may have been one of the only people who enjoyed my book for that episode. So this is another book by that author that came out this year. It was definitely not as good as Dead Romantics. There were parts of it that I really did not enjoy, but it's going to get an honorable mention. It's going to get one because I did end it with a smile on my face, so that was good. These Deadly Prophecies by Andrea Tang, which is kind of a murder mystery magic-y book. I will say about this one, I hate to say this, but I hated the narrator of it. It may have been higher up on my list if I had read it as a book. I'm very curious about that. I might try reading it again someday just to see, because I did enjoy the story. I did enjoy the book itself. I just could not stand the narrator. So that's why I did not really make it on the list, but it is getting an honorable mention. And then The Truth According to Ember, which was the romance book I talked about by Danica Nava for our Indigenous episode. And I think those are it.
All right. Thank you, Sadie. My honorable mentions, one that almost made it onto my list, and then I had to make difficult choices. The Deep Dark by Molly Knox Ostertag graphic novel, which I really, really enjoyed. I love all the stuff that they've done. And this one was a little bit more adult than the other ones, and I really, really enjoyed it. I thought it just kind of delved into places that they haven't gone before as an author, and I cannot wait to see what they do next. Another on my string of really great first fiction books for adults that made me profoundly sad, Kate DiCamillo's Otis and Timble. Something about that rat and that owl, man. That really got me. I don't know why, but it got me. One of my favorite authors, Simone St. James. I really liked Murder Road. I thought it was a really neat examination of kind of the story of the hitchhiker, the female hitchhiker on the road, and that was really, really good. What You Are Looking For is in the Library by Michiko Aoyama, translated by Alison Watts. I also really enjoyed, again, on that spate of like super cozy Japanese in translation, kind of almost like short stories. Maybe I just really liked this one because it was in the library, but there were others that I didn't like as much. But this one worked for me. This one really worked for me. Speaking of which, More Days at the Murasaki Bookshop by Satoshi Yagasawa, translated by Eric Ozawa. I like better than the original book, which is not something I often say about sequels. But the second book, again, it got me. It got me real good. 2 cookbooks that I really enjoyed this year, because I love reading a cookbook, even though I haven't really cooked that much. Banchan by Carolyn Choi and Big Vegan Flavor by Nisha Vora are 2 really, really excellent cookbooks that just came out that I thought were wonderfully designed. I love the stories involved with them. I like the way they write. I think they're just kind of like gorgeous, delicious books. And maybe one more. I have to salute Bora Chung. Your Utopia came out at the beginning of this year, translated by Anton Her, of course. Truly excellent, truly amazing. She creeps me out. She creeps me out and unsettles me. And sometimes I like that. And even though the reading experience was extremely difficult for me, I am still going to say an honorable mention for Anton Her's debut novel, Toward Eternity. If you listen to the episode, it was a visceral, physical response that was none of his fault. And I'm gonna leave it there. It's still on my list. All right, Emma, what things didn't make the cut?
All right. I actually also have The Deep Dark on mine. I love Molly Knox Ostertag. I really liked this book. I do lean more towards the creepy, the dark, the supernatural. So I really, really liked this one. But at the very last second, I replaced it with Plain Jane and the Mermaid because that one just blew me out of the water. But no, The Deep Dark was really, really good. I really loved that book. Gay Girl Prayers, as I mentioned, Emily Austin's poetry collection. I threw in those 2 volumes of Yona of the Dawn that came out this year because they're always going to be great and I'm always going to love them. Knock that one off of your bingo card. There was a book that I started that I didn't quite finish because I had to like put a pause on it to read stuff for Keep It Fictional. But it was called The Tower. It's about Mary, Queen of Scots. And I stopped reading it like right at the point where it started to get sapphic. So that's one that like I was enjoying it, but it was a little bit slow moving. And I'm looking forward to going back to it. So you know what? We'll throw it in the honorable mentions, mainly just because I love Mary, Queen of Scots. And I also have Somewhere Beyond the Sea in here. I did not like it as much as The House in the Cerulean Sea. I enjoyed it. It definitely made me tear up. But there's like Corene had just said, there's something about sequels where I usually just don't like them as much as the first one. But I did listen to the audiobook of this one like almost entirely in one sitting because I just had to keep going. And you got to give credit to that. And then one more audiobook. There was one where I'd actually started this one as a print book and I couldn't really get into it. There was something about like The writing was so literary fiction that I was like, we get it. You're smart. You're using big words, whatever. But once I switched to the audiobook, which was narrated by one of my favorite audiobook narrators, Maren Ireland, who also does the Beartown series. Once I switched to the audio, I really, really liked it a lot more. So this book was called Housemates, and it was about a group of queer women living in a queer house in West Philadelphia. And maybe it was because I was listening to this audiobook while also watching a lot of Abbott Elementary, which also takes place in West Philadelphia. But I was really fascinated with like the deep dive into like queer and working class Pennsylvania that it took. And the audio was much easier to get through than the physical book. So we'll give that one a shout out. And I will listen to any audiobook that Maren Ireland narrates. And then my last one, I actually did not read this one in entirety. It was a nonfiction book, but I was flipping through chapters here and there, kind of taking what I wanted out of it. This book was called Play with Your Cat with an exclamation point. And the reason it makes it into my honorable mentions is because every time my cat is being like a feral little monster, I just hear the title of the book screaming in my head, play with your cat. And I play with her. And so it's done a good job of kind of conditioning me. It's done what it's set out there to do, where it's conditioning me to play with my cat in order to help make her behavior better. So I have to give credit to that one for the work that it is achieving. And that is my honorable mentions list.
I like that you chose like a self-help book for your cat in a way as your honorable mention. So very interesting.
My cat needs a lot of help, so.
Okay. It's the final countdown, people. We're going for gold. We're going for your number one read of the year. You liked this book. All the other books are trash. This is the only one that stands triumphant on the corpses of the other books. It reigns supreme. Which book will that be, Virginia?
So mean to all the other books. It makes me feel so mean to other books now. I'm like, oh, so much guilt. Anyway, the number one pick of the year for every year since we've done this has always been a book where the minute you put it down, you're like, yep, that's it. That's my favorite book of the year. Doesn't matter what time of the year you read it. Like I read Interior Chinatown in January. I'm like, yeah, that's it. Doesn't matter what other books come after that. You just know it has that quality. And this year's pick is no exception, even though I know that the author actually has another book coming out later in the year. But I'm like, no, this is going to be the one. Because I think this is the book that made me finally, I feel like, fully realize the magician that is this author. A fact that both Fiona and Mark have long recognized. And it took me like 5 books to kind of get there. So a little late. But my number one pick for 2024 is Paul Celan and the Trans-Tibetan Angel by Yoko Tawada, translated from German into English by Susan Bernofsky. Yoko Tawada, of course, very well known for her prize-winning novels written in Japanese, including the Akutagawa Prize winner, which is, of course, part of the year that I'm doing a lot of those. But this one is actually written in German because she can write in both because she is amazing. And when I said to Mark that this was my favorite Tawada book, he was kind of surprised. And he must have done the thing that Sadie Hall taught us all to do, which is to say, interesting, and not really comment on it. But I feel like I really, really connected with this particular book, and it just really, really speaks to me. He pointed out that this is probably not one of Tawada's more major works, I guess, so to speak. Suggested in the Stars, which came out in October, which I also really love. It's kind of like considered more like a bigger publishing event kind of thing. This one actually originally came out in 2020 on the 100-year anniversary of Celan's birth and also the 50-year anniversary of his death. So originally, I believe Tawada planned to write an essay about Paul Celan and ended up writing a novel about somebody who really, really have a huge influence on her. And I'm so, so, so glad that she ended up writing this novel. It's a story about Patrick, who lives in Berlin and is set in sort of a post-pandemic times. Patrick often refers to himself as the patient because even though things are opening up again, the patient finds it kind of difficult to leave the house, kind of difficult to reintegrate himself into the society, is already something that he's not great at. So when he goes out, there's certain things that he has to do. So for example, when he gets to an intersection, he has to turn left. And most of the time, he spends his time just, enjoying his favorite operatic performances on DVD instead of going to the opera house. And his favorite opera singer, he thinks, lives in Berlin, and sometimes he even bumps into her. Patrick is a literary scholar, literature student who was originally hoping to do a talk on Paul Celan's poetry collection in Paris. But when he was filling out the application, there was a question that sort of scares him away. The question that asks, what is your nationality? It's a question that he doesn't really know how to answer. He doesn't want to answer. So even though he would love to do a talk on one of his favorite poets, he decided that he's going to pass on that opportunity. But he thinks about it a lot because he has a lot of things to share about Paul Celan. One day he's out and he was sitting in a cafe when a stranger came up to him. The person introduced himself as Leo Eric Fu, and he seems to know a lot about Patrick for some reason. And Patrick finds himself spending a pretty good time chatting with this stranger about poetry, about music, about operas, about Paul Celan, of course, about counting numbers and counting letters in Celan's poems, something that he loves to do. And it happens that this stranger also has an anatomy book with him, an anatomy book that belongs to his grandfather that he claims that is the same book that Paul Celan also has, not the same copy, but the same book. But he has seen Paul Celan's copy and he has copied all the things that Paul Celan underlined or the extra poem that he adds to it. And he said, I'll lend it to you. You can read it. But who is the stranger? Why does he know so much about Patrick? Why does he know so much about his interests, about his life? This stranger seems to know. I reread this book this past week, and in a 131-page novel, there is so much packed to it. I didn't bring my copy with me, but there was just another round of post-its that was stuck in every single line that I need to transfer into my notebook. And it will be interesting to see what resonates with me this time compared to the last time I read the book. I feel like this is one of those books that you can reread and you will be able to find different sounds, different words, different imagery to savor every single time. I think this is the one, like I said, that made me really appreciate Tawada's play on words, her very surprising word choices, the way she develops an image, the way she works at it, the way she transforms it, that makes you think of that and nothing else for days. And so much like Overstaying, my second book, you really do kind of enjoy this book at a sentence level. And of course, I love the whole blurring of kind of boundaries. It makes you question reality. You're not really sure what's real in a book, and that's something that I love in a book. And what is time? A question that I'm sure we all ask a lot frequently during the pandemic and probably after. Paul Celan, the inspiration for this book, is a poet that I'm not familiar with because I don't really read poetry. He's a post-World War II author whose parents both were killed in a concentration camp during the Holocaust, but he writes in German, which is quite interesting. I'm inspired to pick up his poetry because in this book, there's a lot of his work kind of reference directly that you can see, but also I think indirectly as the translator notes point out at the end. So I'm sure there's lots of things that I didn't quite get. So I'm really hoping that I could pick up his poetry and then kind of go back to this book and reread it and see what I get out of it that time. I feel like it's fitting that my number one book is one of Mark's favorite authors. I feel very fortunate that I still have a chance to talk to him about books and that he sends me a lot of potential Virginia books that he sees at his library. I'm sure he has absolutely no interest in octopus and definitely no interest in cannibals or corpses or whatnot, but he knows how to get my attention. Here, Virginia, a book about bugs. So yeah, I'm really thankful for that. I read all his suggestions and not a lot of people can make me deviate from my spreadsheet. So I just wanted to kind of give a shout out to him. I think there's a lot of corners and nooks and crannies of the reading world that I have gone to in the past year because of him. So I just want to acknowledge that. This is also a very slim book. As I mentioned, 2024 is a year of very, very short books for me. And I do believe that just because the book is short doesn't mean that it's a quick read, doesn't mean that it doesn't require careful writing, doesn't mean that it won't take you on an emotional roller coaster ride. And I do feel that about a lot of the books that I read, I'm just totally haunted by them. I also feel a little bit like I'm moving into Fiona's territory of books about kind of not much happening. That's kind of like Fiona's thing. And I feel like I'm kind of getting there. This year, I have very little kind of patience for a plot-driven book. I think I'm getting worse and worse for that. I just want to sit with a book, and just think about the ideas, think about the words, think about the images, and whether they all connected together or not is not really important to me. And I don't know, that's just kind of like the phase I'm in right now. So this book, I think, definitely really connected with me. It is the right Tawada book for 2027. I'm jumping on 2027. I don't know where that came from.
What is time?
Right Tawada book for 2024. I know, right? What is time? 2024. And it resonates with me a lot. So my number one pick, and thank you for coming into my life, this book, Porcelain and the Trans-Tibetan Angel by Yoko Tawada, translated by Susan Bernofsky.
Lovely. So yeah, a very Virginia book for your top pick. Beautifully written, complex, not much happens. So we're going to turn it over to Sadie to see if Sadie's top book of this year is a very Sadie book.
My least hated or favorite, as some other people might say, book of 2024. I have also talked about on the podcast before. I think for our fall color episode. Trying to remember. And this one, it brought me back to my roots in so many ways. It was a young adult fantasy assassin romance book. Yeah, and it kind of evoked feelings of fall and cobblestone streets and fog and all of that kind of stuff. So it kind of put me into the feeling, the mood of the season as well. I just really enjoyed the story, enjoyed the characters. And this was The Dagger and the Flame by Catherine Doyle. So this follows the Cloaks and the Daggers, two enemy groups in the city of Fantôme. And it follows 17-year-old Seraphine, or Sarah, whose mother is brutally murdered by the Daggers. And when she sees that, she escapes to the Cloaks and is starting to be trained as a cloak. However, she is also marked for death. And so she is trying to battle constantly being followed by an assassin and almost killed, and her own kind of feelings of grief over her mother, and also a horrible creature that has started attacking the city without any care for who it kills. And she kind of starts to learn more about these creatures and starts to learn how these creatures might actually be connected not only to her mother, but to her mother's death, and her mother might have more to do with the creation of them than Sarah originally thought. And Sarah might have more power than Sarah originally thought. And so when she is finally face to face with the assassin who is trying to kill her, she realizes that she has the ability to slowly drain his magic away. And in the moment when that happens, when she sees the shock in his eyes, she takes her opportunity and plunges a letter opener into his stomach. This does not kill him, though. It just makes him more angry. But as the two go back and forth, they start to realize that there's more going on. Not surprising. And they begin a bit of a romance, but they're on opposite sides. How will it ever work? And as more secrets are revealed, the two of them have to kind of make a choice as to what they're going to do for their futures. Can it actually work for them? And what's going to happen to the city? And will they be able to stop this attacking monster in the city? As I said, it fits all of my boxes. It checks everything. It was exactly kind of what I needed at the time. It brought me back to my kind of classic route, which is wonderful. And it just kind of, it was what I needed at the time. And there's a sequel. I do like a good series. I think people know that about me. I'm a series reader. So I'm excited for the sequel of this one as well. This is The Dagger and the Flame by Catherine Doyle, my number one least hated book of the year.
Possibly like the sadiest book? Can your name take the superlative? The sadiest book?
I'm going to say yes. Yeah, I think it can. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the sadier book, the sadiest book.
Yeah.
So
the most Sadie book. The very most. Yeah, I think it works. I think it totally works.
Yeah. Okay, fantastic. All right. Well, again, I'm also going to play true to type in choosing my top book of the year, in that you could pretty much read the cover of this book and be like, I wonder whose pick this was. Now, I am actually going to say that this was the second most painful reading experience of the entire year. Number one, obviously, is Nanites. I'm so sorry, Aunt her. I'm so sorry. That was a book that gave me physical pain, and this one did too. Usually, as you know, I sit down, I read a book in one go. That's how I prefer to read a book. I don't usually extend books. I don't usually like to read them over a long period of time. But I was physically unable of reading this book for more than a couple of pages at a time because it made me too angry. Let me be perfectly clear. I hate everyone involved in this book. I hate who it's about. I think I hate the author as well. I hate what happened. I hate every sentence that I had to read. I just was full of like a visceral rage reading this entire thing. And yet, this is my top book of the year. I didn't enjoy it. I wanted to enjoy it, and I didn't. I'm angry. Even thinking about it makes me angry. And yet, here we are. This is my gold book. It's not the cowboy ghost romance, although that would have been awesome. This is very much a Corene book. This is in the spirit of the $12 million stuffed shark. And this is All That Glitters, a story of friendship, fraud, and fine art. So, if you can or cannot guess, this is a nonfiction book about art crimes. This one is very interesting. It is about the Bernie Madoff of the art world. So, Orlando Whitfield, whose dad ran Christie's for a while, as you do, meets another equally privileged young man at Goldsmiths University London. They are both studying art, into art history, and thinking about becoming gallerists, movers, and shakers in the art world. They pull off a couple of sales. They find a Banksy unattended and then lose it. And eventually they part ways as Inigo starts delving a little bit deeper, going a little bit richer, and being a little bit riskier. He starts making connections and starts buying and selling and acquiring big paintings for big money. Eventually, Orlando finds himself employed by his former friend for his gallery. He's writing catalogs for him, kind of do-nothing job that eventually bores him, and soon he starts doing smaller jobs for Inigo, starts trading things, starts couriering things to different places. Eventually, Orlando finds himself in rehab, and Inigo's on the run for art fraud. What a surprise. Somehow in this little art gallery that he was running, he's on the hook for $86 million of art fraud. Like you do. He will be sentenced to 7 years of jail. He will serve 3 and is currently out and married to a socialite. Like you do. This is a deep dive into the nitty-gritty, ugly world of art. This is not an appreciation about art. While Orlando Whitfield can speak lovingly of like the young British artists or different up-and-coming painters and sculptors, this has never been about the art. The art market, unlike other markets, is unregulated. There are no rules. There is no one overseeing it. Money is bought and sold and traded. Paintings move from warehouse to warehouse before ever really going on a wall or being appreciated by anyone. Inigo, because he works in this world of privilege and network and old money and new money and wears the right clothes and says the right things, is able to really con 86 million out of people because the art world is a con. He is just a player in a larger circle of liars and money grubbers and people gambling to win. He's only unlucky in the way that he got caught. When asked by the judge why he did this, Ian says For the money, Your Honor. The judge asks, "That simple?" "That simple." This is a very interesting story. It's about a con man, but written by someone who at some point was a very, very good friend, eventually an employer, and still continues to be friendly with Inigo, even now. Orlando Whitfield is aware of his privilege at all times when writing it. There's a little bit of a wink at the audience talking about fancy dinners and all the fancy people that he got to meet and all the money that's being flown around him. He is both part of the world and trying to critique that world and does not always succeed. Where he does really flourish is when he's convincing you of the absolute absurdity about this world and the obscene sums of money being traded around just for fun and pleasure. This is the story of fraud, of people defrauding other rich people, of rich people losing some money, and just with a thin veneer of civilization over it. The art world is never really about art. It's all about the money. If you are looking for kind of like an interesting look at fraud, how it's perpetuated, if you're like me, deeply interested in the economics of art, it's a small circle, but I'm sure there are some of us out here. If you're kind of looking for like an Anne Rule version of art fraud, I can absolutely recommend this book. The truth will set you free, but it will make you extremely angry first. With every page, you will learn new and horrific things about the fabulously wealthy, and it will make you want to tear down some buildings. So yeah, was this a fun read? No. No, I had a terrible time. It took me 2 months to read this book. But did I overall feel that it elicited the most emotions and was told in a very interesting way and from a different angle? Yes. Did I learn a bunch of things? Yes. So in that way, and is tradition, I am going to actually recommend this book. Give yourself lots of time. Lots and lots of time to kind of get through this one. It's not a sit down read. Give yourself lots of time and really gain a deeper appreciation for a market and a world that we think is like the pinnacle of civilization, but it's actually just about the dirty, grubby, cold, hard cash in all that glitters. So angry. So angry. It's the book that's taken me the longest to read in my life. All right, which leads us to our final number one book of 2024 or 2027 if you're living in Virginia's reality. To each their own. So Emma, what is the gold standard to which all other books have been judged?
Well, this one, we talked before about whether Sadie's book was the Sadiest of Sadie books. And I would say that this is the Emmaist a book could possibly get. If you put a bunch of facts about me, my interest, my personality into an AI and asked it to write a book for Emma, it would write Private Rights by Julia Armfield. Actually, it wouldn't because an AI can't write this. An AI can't write this well. Only Julia Armfield could write Private Rights. But this book nonetheless was made for me. So it's marketed as a sapphic retelling of King Lear, which is my favorite Shakespeare play, as our listeners well know, since I talk about the eye gouging. And the description says that it's about three sisters navigating queer love and loss in a drowning world, which I would say is more or less true, but that doesn't capture how deeply messed up this book is. I wouldn't necessarily call it horror, but there's definitely something creepy going on, much like in Julia Armfield's first book, Our Wives Under the Sea, which is, I read it for the first time this year. I hadn't read it before. It's not a 2024 book, but if I could talk about other books today, that one's like my favorite book I've ever read in my whole life. So this one is, I would say it's a masterclass in tension building. It starts off very, very slow, much like Corene's book. It was not a page turner. It took me quite a long time to get through the entire thing, and it was only 300 pages, but it just builds and builds the whole time. So obviously we have three sisters. We have Goneril, or actually Isla, who is the oldest, and she's kind of neurotic, a bit of a narcissist, and always needs to be in charge. She's going through a divorce, and she's a therapist who, maybe more than anyone else I've ever encountered, is in desperate need of her own therapy. We also have the Regan, or Irene, who's just such a bitter person. She's awful. She's so mean to everybody. Even her like very, very sweet and kind partner who cooks for her and holds her when she's depressed and loves her like nobody else has the patience for. And she's just awful. She's so awful to them, but I loved it. I love how mean she is. And then we have Agnes, our Cordelia, who would rather be swimming. So the three sisters, they all hate each other, much like in the play, and aren't really in contact until they're forced together by the sudden death of their father, our King Lear, who's the famed architect Stephen Carmichael. Now, the three girls are forced to work together to plan his funeral, sort out his estate, and figure out what they're going to do with his magnum opus, his like biggest architecture project of his life, which is a glass mansion that the girls grew up in. This house that holds all of their childhood trauma. And all while this is happening, the world is drowning in this kind of vague and unnamed climate apocalypse. So for those that have read King Lear, we obviously have the storm. There are no more roads. People have to take ferries and water taxis everywhere. There are frequent power blackouts, and it is raining constantly. So the book actually alternates between different sort of POV chapters. It's all written in third person, but we see from each sister's perspective. And then in between those, there's a chapter that's from the point of view of the city, which is always extremely poetic and also devastating, kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of what like the climate change looks like in this world. So back to the main conflict. In preparation for the funeral, Irene and Isla, the two older sisters, noticeably without Agnes, meet with a lawyer to discuss their father's will. And they discover that while he left large sums of the money to all three sisters, Isla has decided for the group that they're not going to accept the money, although Irene secretly accepts the money, and that causes a whole fiasco involving throwing wine glasses at people. But he left the entire house to Agnes, the youngest and the favorite, or the Cordelia of the group. And from here, the two older sisters really start to lose their marbles once they realize that Agnes has inherited the house. So this book, I would say, is required reading for anyone with a complicated relationship with their sister. It was relatable in ways that I don't know if I was quite ready to reconcile with. It discusses grief and depression and anxiety and suicide, the impending doom of climate disaster, childhood trauma, homophobia, complex parent relationships. It's got it all. And I just love it. I love that they made them all gay. So on top of that, Julia Armfield, like I said, made all of Lear's daughters gay. I can't thank her enough for doing that. This is the book that like really absolutely changed my life. It did take a long time for me to get through. It was really, really slow in the tension building. But I think I read the last like 50 pages of it in a matter of an hour. Like once things really hit the fan, you fly through the end. It was impeccable. I can't give it high enough praise. So in summary, everyone should read this book. It's creepy, it's dark, it's depressing, and it's gay, and I loved it. And that's Private Rights by Julia Armfield.
All right. So I feel like we kind of we got ourselves. We did it. We did us. The Virginiaist, the Sadieist, the Emmaist, the Coreneist. So as we wrap up, I would like you, and I'm springing this on you, I'd like you to choose one word to sum up your reading year. A single solitary word to wrap up that reading year. So you've had your gold, your garnet, your leather, other stuff. You know, fourth year, fifth year, by that point, no one's giving you stuff, right? Should I have been sending anniversary gifts to people?
I feel like paper's in there somewhere. I think paper's got to be in there somewhere.
I feel like paper is a good one. I remember I was doing this for something and one kid asked, what do you get for an 80th wedding anniversary? And I was like, I don't know that there is. But 80 years, like you would be like.
That's when you get into like the diamonds and the silver and the gold and platinum. Is it platinum?
Hold on, I'm bringing it up. I feel like you'd be dead at that point, unless you got married when you were 1. Grade 3 gift, or grade 3. Grade 3 gift is pearls, topaz. I think it depends on whether I'm looking at a jewelry store or something else. Interesting. Anyways, as we prevaricate, does anyone have a word for their reading year? that sums it all up. I can go first to give you more time. Mine is going to be frustrating. Yep. I read a lot of things that just frustrated me. And even though they were good, I could accept that, but that's my word.
I'm going to go with creepy. A lot of the things that I really, really liked this year were things that were really, really creepy.
I'm going to go with tearful. Because not all of the books that I liked made me cry, but the ones that did made me cry a lot. A lot. So yeah, I'm going to go with tearful.
To remind me, I didn't cry on this episode. I feel like that's my accomplishment. Right? Yeah, what's happening? I don't know. That's too hard. I think I was gonna say short because I think that really sums up the books that I read. Yeah, let's just go with that. I'm just gonna say short.
Okay, so a short, tearful, creepy, frustrating year. Clearly, we love to read.
Oh, the year surely does not feel short, but okay.
Well, with those positive adjectives, we will look forward to perhaps less intense or maybe just the same intensity. Sometimes the catharsis is nice. Sometimes the catharsis is really nice. But with these, let me do some quick math, 20 plus honorable mention, excellent books. We hope that within there you find a book that maybe speaks to you a little bit, maybe something a little bit creepy, maybe something on the shorter side, maybe something that will make you cry so hard you can barely breathe. Ideally, not something super frustrating. Just stay away from the cowboy ghost romance. Like, it's just, there's no need. Stay away from the nanites. Stay away from the nanites.
The nanites are fine. Still have to pick that book up. I think like you sold me on it with whatever that noise that you made on that episode. Sadie and Emma should go listen to it. But yeah, I have to pick up the nanites. I definitely also have to pick up Private Rights, Emma. I feel like awful that I haven't read it yet. But yeah.
Virginia, you'd love it. You'd love it.
Yeah, I love her other books so much. I think we'll be fine. So
yeah, I'll read Sadie's because I feel like that would be a fun romp. Stuff happens. There's nothing wrong with stuff happening. Sometimes it's fun to have a thing happen.
Overrated. See, that's why this is the perfect group of people, because we have people who want stuff to happen, and then we have people who is okay with.
Don't need stuff to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's perfect. Then whoever our readers are, whatever their preferences are, they will find something to read.
Truly something for everyone. Well, we hope you have a very eventful and or uneventful end to 24, the year 24. Virginia's going into the future. I've regressed back to the past.
The uneventful is good, right? Stuff does not happen. It's good. I like to have an uneventful year. It's a good thing. So stuff does not need to happen in life or in books.
But events can be good. Events can be exciting. Events can be fun.
Sadie makes a good point there.
I can't name one from the 2024. So
if nothing happened, you never would have seen TJ Klune.
I feel like I wouldn't have gone if it weren't for all of you. So because I don't like to meet people that I love. I get.
I got that sense as you literally ran away at the end of the night.
Ran away when everybody was like, let's take pictures, TJ Klune. I'm just like, no, I'm good.
I've never seen you move so fast.
I know, right? And like Emma was like, you're gonna get run over by a car. Like, just, yeah.
I did say that.
Yeah, I don't do well with, yeah.
What are book friends for? If not to introduce you to new books and drag you to places that you would otherwise never go to, have a good time, because sometimes events can be good. But that's fine. Again, we have books for readers who like things to happen and books for people who there are words. So we have a little bit of something for everyone. On behalf of all of your book friends here at the Port Moody Public Library, those are here, and some of our guests that we've had over this year with our very exciting 200? 200. That's bananas. Here's to another 200. Wait, how many weeks are there in a year? Oh, I don't think this is going to math out. This is not going to math out.
Special name for 200? Or I mean, we passed 200. What's a special name for 250?
230.
Or, like this. Numbers are not working today. 250 or like 300? Are there special words for those?
Oh, tricentennial?
Okay, so we'll look for our tricentennial episode.
In 2026. Guys, we're here for the books. We're not here for the math. You've come here for math facts. You've come to the wrong place.
Unless Corene is reading math books, which she does sometimes.
I do.
Like Nine Fox Gambit or Zero Sum Game?
Some game. Yeah, that
There
was
you
math.
go. Yeah. So math also happens on this show. Get everything here.
Yes. So, from all of your book friends at the Port Moody Public Library, past, present, future, in the very, very far past of the year 24, we hope that you had a lovely 2024 reading time, and here's to a fantastic year full of books in 2025 when BTS is coming back. All right, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.